moving on, many of you will already know that these roundtable have been brought to us purely by volunteers and sponsors. So we haven't paid anybody for the work here. And I'm pleased to say that really one of the most important sponsors was PwC. I've heard it said that this firm understands the importance of sustainability, especially managing climate risks that we are facing. What do I know? You be the judge of that. Anyway, PwC offered pro bono to pull together the report of proceedings for the 2021 RT roundtable sessions. And two very hardworking people in this were their executive chairman, Dato Faiz Azmi, and their partner, Marina Mokhtar. So I'd like to welcome them to join us now and to walk us through the findings of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. And thank you for also pointing out that this is pro bono. We don't do it very often. So ladies and gentlemen, firstly, I would like to thank CAN CGM for inviting us back today to kind of explain a little bit about the report that we've helped draw up based on the various roundtables. As Johan mentioned, there's myself and for Marina Mokhtar. But before Marina gets into the detail, maybe I should just set the context a little bit of this report. Firstly, this report is really about capturing a whole of society approach, by which I mean that if you look at the participants of the roundtables, you'll see that it wasn't just government agencies and a few corporates, but we had NGOs, we had experts, we also had people coming along who could contribute to some of these ideas. And we think it's very important. It's very important to be able to demonstrate to the government that actually we as a society are fully behind what they intend to do. And in fact, we don't need to be told to do it. The other thing that these roundtables also helps with is to provide the government with another forum to test out some of their proposed policies or to get data points or feedback on some of the things that they intend to do. So first point, whole of society approach. The second point, of course, is that the roundtables have been extraordinarily successful. I think Sunita has mentioned the numbers of people involved. And so the plan for this year, 2022, is to widen the stakeholder reach. So we are planning together with CAN and CGM to basically meet up with stakeholders from the youth, from the royal houses, and also the states, because that's obviously a key player in some of these decisions. So that's something to look forward to. And then finally, just to emphasize, this is not a PwC consultant's report, by which I mean a consultant's report usually requires a fair bit of research and lots of alternative ideas and so on. That wasn't the mandate. The mandate was really to report proceedings. So it was, if you like, a little bit like reporting in the form of minutes. So that is why some of the views expressed could be considered a bit controversial, but that's fine, because the whole intention was really to try and capture as many views as possible so that the decision makers, the policy makers, at least had a sense as to what's going on. The other thing that I would say is that we have not tried putting words into people's mouths, nor have we tried to edit them. So with that context and in that setting, can I now hand over to Marina to take you briefly through the report. Marina?
Thank you, Dato Faiz. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a great pleasure to have been working closely with Datin Sri Sunita and her team, including Dato Sri Johan, in coming up with this report of proceedings. In fact, I have been to personally join in a couple of the roundtable sessions, and truly, that's what has been mentioned by Dato Sri Johan. You don't just see industry leaders, you see competitors, you see NGOs, public sector, passionately talking towards the same goal. And this has actually, bring us a lot of positivity in terms of, how do we go towards this low carbon emissions pathway. And without further ado, I'll just share briefly what is in the report, and this has been put up and published in the CGM's blog, which you can actually have a read of the entire report. But what I will do today is just to share with you briefly what the contents of these reports are and key salient points in each of these roundtable findings. So in the report itself, we have the report objectives as well as, where we are heading towards as Malaysia, the whole of society, all of government approach, and each thematic findings that we find within the 4 sectors in this roundtable. So the 4 sectors, as mentioned earlier, were energy sector, property and construction, plantation, and telecommunications. And we've also added a chapter on LULUCF because, again, Malaysia, we are very privileged to have such great biodiversity, and we need to be able and to be conscious on how we manage this and not just think about how to reduce the emissions. So as mentioned, this was actually both CEO Action Network and Climate Governance Malaysia coming together, organizing this roundtable, which we mentioned earlier. And the objective of this report really, as what Dato Faiz mentioned, is to have a knowledge bank within the CGM network as well to what has been discussed with the private sectors, the public sector, the NGOs, and it serves as a form of awareness as well in terms of what are the key issues that industries are facing and what are the areas of support that are needed by the private sector, and more importantly, what the commitments by the private sectors are, because it's not just about what the government can do for me, but what can I do for myself and the company. And this is really the first report of proceedings that we would like to share. So as mentioned earlier, we talk about, just awareness on sustainability and climate change has actually prompted a global response to tackle issue through policy and market solutions. And we Malaysians as well have announced carbon neutral Malaysia by 2050. We are pleased to inform that even in the RMK 12, there are clear targets, and as what Dato Sri Zaini Ujang have mentioned earlier, more pledges have been made. And again, this is a step towards the right direction. Inaction is no longer an option for us. We've seen what other countries have done. Yes, there are some that are a bit more advanced in terms of the commitment, but Malaysia is not too far behind. We have started in terms of having certain commitments, but what has been discussed across the roundtable is not for the short of having clear policy directions, but it's about accelerating some of these towards action and towards implementation. And I will share with you in detail after this. What's important as well, we realize is that there are various stakeholders that are impacted by this climate change, and not just about getting their buy-in, but working together towards climate change. We don't just think about what we have in terms of the local government, the local councils, the SMEs, that what we mentioned about capacity building of the SMEs. But at the national level, we talk about the policies makers, we talk about some of the regulators as well as the NGOs, and of course the global level. There are foundations, investors, as well as other international institutions, NGOs, investors, who are already taking an action in terms of climate action plan, and this would definitely impact not just at the national level, but at the local level. Consequences of inaction, there are many that we have highlighted here. We don't only talk about just environment and climate related risk, but there are direct impact to the economy as well as the businesses and households. Hence why I mentioned it's not just about what the country's policies are, but the commitment of the big industry players like what Dato Sri Zaini Ujang mentioned, leading the way, like Petronas, TNB, and PwC ourselves have pledged for net zero. And this, we know that they are impact to not just businesses, but also to households. We were quite unfortunate when there was very bad floods quite recently. And these are again a reminder to all of us that climate change is not just a global issue, it's not just a national issue, but it's an issue that comes close at heart. And implications of these risks are manifold. They're not just reputation, access to financing may be difficult. We have seen investors taking into account what are the ESG practices and the political risks that are of course increasing in terms of activism and because of awareness as well. So some of the thematic concerns that have been raised during the roundtable that affect these 4 key stakeholders are essentially one, basically towards the global level, the sharing of some of this thought leadership. How do we institutionalize some of these policy matters, the issues of carbon sinks and mega biodiversity? How do we look at the funds for sustainability agenda and utilizing more of these globally publicly available funds? On the public sector side, there were concerns about data transparency as well as unverified and unclaimed data. So a lot of discussions have been made about data-driven decision making as well as policy making. But again, this is something that is advocated by the private sector, which would help inform the policies, not just at the federal state, but the federal level, but also the state as well. And this is to avoid any conflicting or misaligned policies. Of course, with the private sector, clear framework and legislation is needed with support of financing. And at the people level, we talk about socio-economic challenges, we talk about issues on capacity building, as well as certain awareness when we talk about dependency on certain polluting sectors. So now I will share some of the thematic findings. As mentioned earlier, there were 14 roundtable sessions attended by over 4,000 attendees with 50 speakers across 4 industry sectors. And some of the high-level findings that we summarize across all the 4 key sectors, as I mentioned earlier, is there is that great importance of access to open and timely data. There is a point where we need more evidence-based information. So perhaps current legal frameworks can be looked at in terms of data sharing, the use of 4IR technology to advocate technology for good, as also a requirement that can help us improve and monitor the climate risks and enable us to respond quicker and more efficiently. And of course, the integration of the policies. Secondly, we talk about the urgency for government to provide policy signals and to lead the way. As I mentioned earlier, there were many policy that has been announced by the government. So it's about coordination of the implementation and of increase in accountability and how they can actually lead the way. Thirdly, as evident from this roundtable and the commitment that has been given by the CEOs themselves in participating in this, businesses are ready to step up. Some of the steps that the private sector are taking are not just applying to their own business plan, but they are looking at ways to innovate in use of technology on how they can actually manage their carbon emissions as well and do their part in increasing the education to the rakyat. Which is a good segue to the point number 4, which is encouraging behavioral changes. Climate change impact is becoming irreversible. Hence, the understanding of these issues are quite important. The advocacy and awareness have started a long time ago, but there are questions whether there are urgent needs to start more of a stick approach, not just the carrot approach. Of course, the 5th one, as I mentioned earlier, is not just about carbon emissions, it's about carbon sequestration as well. And we know that Malaysia, we have a lot of natural assets that can be proven effective for this. And hence, we need to understand better on how the public and private sector, the federal and the state government can work closely to enhance and increase this LULUCF. And finally, harmonization of laws and regulations. At the state and federal government, there are many questions, legality that may be an issue, but we are all on a learning pathway, and hence this roundtable is also an avenue and a platform to understand what are the best practices in helping with climate change. So with that, I will then go briefly to each of the key salient points of each sector. I understand that if you need more information, the details of it are in the report as well. So in the energy sector, again, we like to acknowledge some of the roundtable participation here, not just from industry, we have from the federal ministry, agencies, and also other bodies like the World Bank, ICIS, RIMA, and Sarawak University. That shows that even youth and NGO are participating in this. Energy sector is always one of the key sectors when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, so it can't be ignored. We talk about the issues of subsidies for gas and fuel, and some of the key themes that have arisen here is that, again, maybe long-term policies exist, but should be implemented. Some of the examples that were given here are the low carbon mobility blueprint and the national energy policy. The thematic recommendations that come with the energy sector, there were 4 key thematics with other recommendations. One is on the increased share of renewables in energy mix. When we talk about increased penetration of renewables, we have the national energy policy. It's time to actually look at how to implement it and what are the issues that's stopping some of the implementation. Secondly, we talk about the long-term power market structure. The roundtable participants discussed about MESI Reform 2.0 that was again under review due to post-COVID, that will actually help to enable penetration of renewable energy and greener generation. Secondly, the roundtable group discussed about electrifying the economy, transport as key focus. We talk about this a lot, about increasing electrification and efficiency of road transport, but what are the other barriers that needs to be removed? It may include certain policies around EVs or even the supply chain when it comes to EV and the transport sector. Thirdly, it's about accelerating development and uptake of new low or zero carbon fuels. There are various research that have been done out there with our universities and institutions which look at new technologies like hydrogen, circular economy. Again, research and innovation is another avenue that has to be encouraged within the private sector together with our local universities and youth to basically harness technology for good. And fourth, about removing remaining emissions through engineered solutions or nature-based. We always talk about, how can we have solutions that are man-made, but we also need to think about how can we have solutions which are nature-based. And that is where they were talking about carbon capture and utilization as well as carbon storage industry. And finally, about conserving and enhancing forests. It's time for us to relook the value of our forests and understand how this can be put a price, quote unquote, to better understand the impact to our economy as well. Other thematic recommendations that were discussed were about public-private partnerships, carbon pricing to incentivize low-carbon solutions. We talk about awareness and communication to the public, as well as mandatory carbon accounting and disclosure, because actions is nothing without accountability. And it's surprising to say that you hear this from the private sector who's voluntarily asking for mandatory disclosure. Next sector is the property and construction sector. Again, thanks and a great acknowledgement to all the participants. We had WWF as well as the TRCRC and other associations in this property and construction sector. The carbon footprint of this sector is not just about construction, because it's a whole value chain that they were talking about, from materials, manufacturing, construction to operation of buildings. We mentioned the National Low Carbon City Master Plan earlier that already promote 5-year plan for low carbon cities, and 33 cities were selected to achieve carbon neutrality. So this is again a good step towards the right direction. And some of the policy recommendations that were discussed with this team are basically, number one, reducing operational and embodied carbon impact. Some of the solutions that were discussed were about energy efficiency, having mandatory energy audit, looking at the kind of materials that can be used. Again, innovation comes into play when we talk about what can we replace in terms of the construction products, the byproducts, and how do we manage the waste materials. Secondly, as what the Zaini Uja mentioned, is governance. Governance and awareness of sector GHG emissions. So a couple of key points that we talk about here is not just governance, the ability to understand and to have the capacity to manage this governance, and also the understanding of what data we need to have and we need to collect in order to understand better how we can actually action upon some of these issues. And finally, conserving biodiversity and natural carbon sinks. Not only we promote conservation of biodiversity in buildings and infrastructure plans, but also I think Plan Malaysia talks about having a green plot ratio to make sure that we actually have green spaces when we actually have certain planning that can also reduce urban heat island effect, right, in all developments. Again, these are some regulatory actions that can be taken within these sectors to actually help reduce carbon emissions. The next slide basically talks about the plantation sector. Again, these are the participants of those roundtable. I would like to say thank you very much to those participants. Again, it's nice to see even competitors speaking to each other. And within the plantation sector, there were a lot of discussions about the extensive use of biomass sources as renewable energy potential. There were also a lot of discussion that talks about innovation in certain production techniques to reduce carbon and water footprint, and certain how can companies capitalize on efficient usage of natural resources. So some of the policy recommendations that were given by the plantation sector were again about increasing the share of renewables in energy mix using their bio-based renewable. Secondly is how they can efficiently use their natural resources when we talk about the plantation sectors. Thirdly is about innovation. How do they actually integrate innovation to their production process, and how they can efficiently use some of the byproducts and waste management. And finally, when we mention about legislation and framework, similar to what we have shared earlier in some of the other sectors, introduce some form of carbon pricing or even shadow pricing to incentivize low carbon solutions. Again, mandatory carbon accounting and disclosure, and revisiting the supply chain by integrating the role of middlemen. I think underpinning all of this basically the availability of data for them to understand where the issues lie. And the last sector is basically the telecommunications sector. Again, you can see that all the big telco companies, even the CEOs themselves, were in the roundtable, and they were very passionate about this discussion as well. And their role is not just about how they can reduce their carbon emission, but how they can play a critical role in spreading awareness and encouraging behavioral changes to the population. That's because everyone has a mobile phone, everyone is connected, and during times of crisis, they are the first ones to reach the population. So their role not just in behavioral changes, to again educating consumers, innovation, not just for themselves, but also how they can help consumers make smart choices, and again, data capture. So some of the recommendations that were discussed were, one, of course, how they can reduce emissions from their own operations when we talk about data centers, and how they can optimize energy efficiency while reducing emissions. And we're proud to say that even TMB themselves have incorporated within their business plan on how they can actually optimize energy efficiency. And there are other telco companies that talk about green energy as an alternative. Secondly, they talk about helping consumers and businesses make the right choice. I think we're in what was mentioned was we are in the society of always on today. Our laptop is always on, our mobile is always on. That all requires energy. And they are, because they are with you all the time and help to educate the consumers to make better informed decisions and to invest in new innovation on how consumers can make smarter choices. And of course, finally, how they can actually build resilience for times of crisis. As I mentioned, during the flood or any crisis for that matter, sometimes telco companies are one of the key companies that needs to be there in times of crisis because they need to be reached. And again, that is why they actually have access to some of the key data that can help to enable behavioral changes. So again, these are some of the commitments or some of the recommendations that were coming from the private sectors in coming together with the government as well as society on how they can actually move towards a low carbon emissions pathway. And finally, on LULUCF, again, we thought that this is a very critical information and point to take note within this roundtable report as well. Hence, we talk about increasing accountability and management of data on LULUCF, how we can actually leverage on our natural assets that we have, and look through a whole of government and society approach in participating through this LULUCF. So we talk about data reporting. I've mentioned about enhancing carbon sequestration, how do we innovate and utilize, and of course, harmonise and the legislation, both at the federal and state level. And of course, what's also important is capacity building at the state and local authorities level. Then with that to also broaden the stakeholder participation. With that, I conclude the summary of the findings. Again, this is just the summary. And again, I would like to thank all those who were participating in the roundtable and who have spent their time to bring this report together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marina. Maybe just to try and answer some questions which appeared in the Q&A. So the first one really relates, at a micro level, it goes, what can Rakyat do? How do you better inform or educate people about the topic of climate change? And obviously there's still disbelievers. So my point is Rakyat can do quite a lot, actually. I mean, firstly, just context. The UN has actually requested member states to better educate their own people about climate change and the impact and so on. So that's something really which the government should do more of and be better at it. But at an individual level, there are many things you can do individually. So for example, do you separate your rubbish? Do you use a cloth bag instead of a plastic bag to buy your groceries? Do you consider whether you really need to use your car? And more importantly, can you afford to get an electric car? So there are many individual things that you can do as a person, but the most important thing, I think, is your voice. So government and the corporate sector need to know that these things matter to you, right? The consumers and also the voters. So I'm told there's a GE coming up soon. Do ask your candidates those questions. Do subscribe to surveys that actually ask you of your view and what you think they should be doing. It's important that the voice be heard, your voice be heard. In terms of the second question, I found the ask of the private sector interesting, lack of sustainability frameworks and standards. You think that actually I'm drowning in the alphabet soup. So there is a hope on the horizon in a way. There is this thing called the ISSB, which has been formed in Frankfurt, the International Sustainability Standards Board. It's paid for by the accountants, the IFRS Foundation. They've already issued 2 standards, and I think their intention is to have these 2 standards issued as final by the end of the year. But the key thing is that it's not another set of standards. Their mandate is don't reinvent the wheel, try to bring everything under one umbrella. So I know they've signed agreements with GRI. They have already adopted SASB standards into themselves. And I believe they're about to sign something with TCFD. So the intention is that eventually ISSB standards will replace everything. That's the intention, one standard for the planet. Any other questions? Oh, there are a few. Why doesn't the government promote biomass and biogas power generation? Actually, That's a very good question. I believe that some of the plantation owners themselves do some of this. And that's one of the questions we want to put to government, because one of the interesting ideas coming out of the roundtables is that, we have an abundance of biomass waste. And there was a study, I believe, in the report that suggested that something like 64% of our power needs could be met by just finding an incinerator and generator to burn that waste. So good question, don't have the answer, but we certainly intend to bring it up. And then the last question is about electric vehicles. Yeah, it is quite sad, isn't it? 274 EVs, and the Singaporeans have a lot. By the way, the Singaporeans don't have any place to charge when they come to Johor, or at least not many of them. So the point, I guess, is that we now need perhaps a more ambitious plan on electric vehicles. The government obviously have expressed some views as to what should be done, but the concern, I guess, is cost. I mean, these cars are still not cheap. Secondly, the replacement of cars also brings other problems. But I totally agree with you. That is directionally where we should be going. But it's not just about cars, right? It's also about EV vans and ultimately EV trucks, because that is also where a lot of the use of transportation is. So at the moment, the government has some plans, but I think they really ought to be doing more. Any other, one last one. When the energy is mainly through gold, so what else can Malaysia do? Well, I think we do have plans to increase the RE. My personal wish is that we were a bit more aggressive with the targets, but this is something which I know the policymakers are looking at. Yes, we have hydropower, but that seems to be more an issue it's obviously an advantage in some states like Sarawak and Sabah, but clearly on our side in Semenanjung, we don't have that many potential hydropower plants. That said, we have heard through the roundtables that there are considerations of perhaps using, as I said, biomass as one possible fuel. Another is to consider mini hydro dams rather than having big ones. And obviously, the number of solar plants that are opening up. But I agree with the thrust of the question, which is we need to do more. So I hope that, there's another one. According to the IMF, our subsidies are staggering 187 billion. I'm not sure about the 187 billion. It sounds a bit much, considering that we only collect 300 billion a year from taxes and so on. But certainly it is a big subsidy. You may have read in the papers that the current Minister of Finance has actually come up very strongly about wanting to relook at this subsidy. And so we do hope the government will make those hard choices. But certainly it's not correct to be subsidizing these things, because it also brings unwanted effects. So for example, because electricity is cheap, maybe we shouldn't be running our air conditioning machines too long. And maybe we should be buying more efficient equipment, but were it not for the fact that power is so cheap. I think that's it. Oh, there's another one. Encik Razif from Saindabi Properties. Quite a number mentioned about internal carbon pricing. Should companies start considering this, and why? Well, I think like all things, it's part of your whole plan to get to zero, right? Because carbon pricing is another aspect of trying to understand where your emissions are, and should you offset them or should you try to reduce them? So the simple answer is yes, you should be considering it. It will come. Going electric is not ideal with 90%. Totally agree. But I know that the parties who are really involved in this, both government and utilities, are looking at this to try and see how they can bring that percentage down. By the way, the percentage I believe is 85, but they're targeting to bring the RE component of it higher over the next 10 to 20 years. Okay, back to you, Sunita.
Thank you so much, Dato Faiz, and thank you so much, Marina. It's been such a pleasure having you here. In the run-up to this launch date, Marina and Dato Faiz and I presented the final draft report to many key ministries, regulators, stakeholders to solicit their feedback. And each time I'm just awed and impressed by the amount of work that has gone into this. So thank you both so very much for making this happen. I was also impressed by the, sorry for Johan, yeah, please.
Sorry, we're interrupting each other. I just want to interrupt. I mean, if I can, one striking thing about the report and all what I heard during the roundtables is that there's a lot more going on than we appreciate, especially those of us who are not in government. And there's a lot, and as a nation, I think we've done a lot of work in investigating, researching, and come up with plans and policies. We're great at plans and policies, far more than our neighbors, I think. But it's action and putting it all together that we lack. And for action, I suppose you have to have coordinated action between different parties that want to come together. And that's probably the thing that we really need to move the next step. Also, if I can say, what's striking is the quality of the questions we just had. And I saw they piled in without us even asking for them. So thank you for that. And keep putting them on. We'll try and find some opportunity to answer them, most of them during the next couple of days, if we can. But I want to recap, still interrupting Sunita, sorry, to recap what Faiz said, okay? I'm really pushing it now. To recap what Faiz said right at the beginning, whole of society approach. No one group, no one sector, no one party can resolve this. It has to be everybody working together. More roundtables. So that was those roundtables is the report of those, and we're going to do more. We have to keep on talking, and we have to bring on more stakeholders and get people comfortable sitting and talking to each other. For example, states, cities, town councils. That's the next layer of people that actually make decisions in this country. And lastly, he said it's not a consultant's report. It wasn't it was our ideas as a collective. It's what we all said. So we have to take ownership of that. So thank you, PwC. Sunita, back to you. So sorry to interrupt.
I was just saying that I was amazed by the simple and elegant solutions which I heard during the roundtable sessions last year, which I feel could get us to decarbonize really quickly. Well.